Having already completed reviews for Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Super Street Fighter 2, it seems logical to avoid repetitive content and just move on to something else. But since when have I been logical when there's two other games in the series to complete the set? Hello there, welcome to Saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground, and welcome to our double retro review. We are going to complete the set by looking at Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. So yes, I'm a completionist, I could not help it. Despite already reviewing Street Fighter 2, Turbo, Super, I just can't seem to move on, knowing that there's two other games in the set. So rather than bombard you with two more videos of a very similar game, I've decided to lump these two games in together and do a double hitter of a retro review. They're going to be quite summarised because we're going to assume you already know what the Street Fighter 2 games are. If not, check out the other reviews. But with that said, let's get started with our review of Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition. Released in arcades 1 year after the original Street Fighter 2, Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition was later ported onto specifically the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis. The game added to the original 8 characters with 4 more new characters, the boss characters from the original game. Whilst those characters were toned down slightly given how overpowered they were still particularly strong compared to the rest of the characters in the game. Another popular addition to the game was for the first time allowing both 1 and 2 players to select the same character and face against themselves. There were some minor different colorations in the game and graphical improvements, and a number of other characters did have their movesets slightly balanced out to make the game more even. However, other than that, there were very few changes to the game. This began the very ongoing trend in Street Fighter 2 games of being a mere update rather than actual sequel. But for those that didn't have the original, or that did and were just desperate to play as those 4 extra characters, it was still very well received. This was probably the key reason whilst the scores did vary, and while some gave scores of around 7 out of 10, garnering around 70%, most were in the high 90s, with some scores even including 5 out of 5s, 10 out of 10s, so effectively 100%. Magazine Mega gave the Sega Mega Drive version of the game a 92% score and actually labelled it as a candidate for the greatest video game ever made, and somewhat dating poorly the statement that it would be the greatest fighting game of all time. That didn't last too long. Sales on the Sega Mega Drive were just below 1.7 million cartridges sold. This was actually below Capcom's expectations and was partly due to it being released up against Mortal Kombat. However, it was still a global success and bestseller worldwide. Hooking this up to modern scrutiny now, it is a tricky one to do. Realistically, this was just step 1 of the constant rehashing of the original game. However, it did add 4 new characters that we'd never played before. It did for the first time add the option to be able to play against the same character. Those were vast improvements on the original, and the game still does play really well today. However, in my opinion, as much as this did start the progression of the Street Fighter 2 games, it just hasn't aged as well as some of the others have. Overall, I would say that giving this a rating of 7 out of 10 is pretty fair. The game is still fun to play, but realistically, you're not going to play this version when the other versions still exist. And of those other versions, the most advanced one that was ever made, the final in the Street Fighter 2 subgenre, was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Released into arcades in 1994, this was the first and only version of the Street Fighter 2 games not to be released on the Super Nintendo or the Sega Mega Drive. Instead, this was released on the 3DO, the PlayStation, and the Sega Saturn, with the game later on receiving ports from multiple other consoles including the Game Boy Advance, Nintendo Switch, the Dreamcast, etc, etc. Had this game been released at the same time, but without any of the other Street Fighter 2 games in between, it would have been an exceptional sequel and would have made a very worthy Street Fighter 3. However, the 4 characters that had been added to this game were also in Super Street Fighter 2. The boss characters had been around since Champion Edition, as we saw just a few moments ago. And whilst there was one other character, Akuma, added into the game, he was an unlockable character, so he wasn't even there from the get-go for all players to use. This Turbo Edition was faster than Super Street Fighter 2, but that isn't really a bonus, considering we'd already seen Street Fighter 2 Turbo. They must have deliberately slowed the game down just so they could speed it back up again, which really smacks of dodgy commercialism at its worst. The game did add other features, such as combos and supers, as well as improving other aspects of the visuals, but once you got into the gameplay, it was still pretty much the same we'd seen since Street Fighter 2. The game was a massive success in arcades, as Street Fighter 2 games always were, and it is this version of the game that is still used in esports competitions to this date. The arcade version of the game will go on to get scores between 90 to 100%, but what about in the home consoles? Well, it's kinda hard to gauge. The 3DO version of the game only got 80% due to some clunky controls and conversions, and other versions of the game were slowed down by disc loading, this being the first time the game had ever been played on a CD instead of a cartridge. Wikipedia reports that the game was in the top 12 selling games for America in 1994, although that just kinda tells me that it didn't quite make the top 10. Other factors that have to play into this was, for the first time, this was being released on new consoles. People may have already had multiple versions of the game for the SNES and Mega Drive, but those with new consoles may not have had Street Fighter 2 at all, so it did allow it to access a new market. However, I don't think those consoles necessarily lent themselves to playing Street Fighter 2 quite as well as the 16-bit consoles themselves actually did. However, giving it the whole retro review, this game is still fantastic. The reality is, I'd never actually played this version of the game. I'd never had this version of the game until quite recently playing it on the Nintendo Switch. And I have to say, this game holds up fantastically. It has every perk that all the other Street Fighter 2 games have without any of the disadvantages. It has the best graphics of all of them, it has all of the characters, it adds the combos, it tidies up the supers and the special moves, so yes, it's the best version of the game. It's still a massive rip-off, and had I bought it at the time, I would have felt completely conned, but that doesn't really matter right now. This should have been Street Fighter 3 without all the other versions in between. But standing up to modern scrutiny, whilst it may be somewhat begrudgingly, I have to say this is the best version of the game made, and it deserves the highest score, that being 8 out of 10. It could be argued that some may even give it a higher rating. The truth is though, fighting games have, realistically and rightly so, moved on from this, but as this series goes, this was its peak. Before I finally close the book on all the Street Fighter 2 games, it has to be said that playing through these has been quite an experience. Street Fighter 2 was the start of something special, and yet repeatedly tapping back into the same market with only minor improvements, in some ways devalued what the game had done. Had we got Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo as Street Fighter 3 without any of the others in between, they may be even more legendary than they already are. Regardless, Street Fighter 2 in all of its versions has a massive place in pop culture. What's your favourite ever Street Fighter 2 game? Comment below, let me know. Until next time, take the high ground.